me hit record. My name is Andrew Brzezinskis. I'm a senior acquisitions editor at the University of Washington Press. The main office of the press is located on the homelands and waters of the Coast Salish peoples, and we pay our respects to their environmental stewardship, past and present. Myself, I've worked in book publishing for about 20 years. I work on books for general readers as well as scholarly titles. I work with historian Paul Sutter on the Weyerhaeuser Environmental Book Series, now entering, depending on how you count it, its 27th or 28th year. Bridget?
Hi, I'm Bridget Berry, I'm editor-in-chief at University of Nebraska Press. The press is part of a land-grant institution with campuses and programs on the past, present, and future homelands of the Pawnee, Ponca, Oda, Missouri, Omaha, Dakota, Lakota, Ka, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, as well as those of the relocated Ho-Chunk, Sac and Fox, and Iowa peoples. I acquire in history, geography, and environmental studies at the press. Work on sort of a broad aspect of environmental history titles, and we're excited to announce a new book series that we're launching called America's Public Lands. It's edited by Char Miller, and books will be looking at sort of a wide aspect of public lands in the United States. Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel LeVay, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm attending this webinar today from Southeast Idaho, where I live and work on the occupied lands of the Shoshone-Bannock people. And I'm an acquisitions editor with the University Press of Colorado and the Utah State University Press imprint. I've been at this press about 4 years, and prior to this role, I was the marketing and sales director at the University of Washington Press and worked there for about 12 years. While there, I did just about everything one can do in a marketing department at one point or another, including publicity, sales, copywriting, metadata, direct mail, social media. And I look forward to talking with you all about your environmental history projects and how to connect them with your audiences and readers. So over to you, Neecole.
Hi everyone. My name is Neecole Bostick, and I'm an acquisitions assistant at University of Washington Press. I'd like to acknowledge that our office is located on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Coast Salish and Duwamish people, past, present, and future, and honor with gratitude the land and their stewardship. I started working in acquisitions at UNC Press, but now I work here at Washington with editors on history books and regional titles, and I've been working here for about 3 years. Now on to you, Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Halley. I'm senior editor at the University of Massachusetts Press. I'm actually based at UMass Boston. UMass Boston campus is on the original homelands of the Mashpee, Wampanoag, Aquinnah, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts tribal nations. I've been at the press for about over 10 years now, and before this I was at Beacon Press. Obviously, I acquire environmental history, both for a series, Environmental History of the Northeast, edited by Richard Judd of the University of Maine and Anthony Penna of Northeastern University, and also more environmental history titles more generally, as well as environmental studies, regional studies about New England, both scholarly and general interest, and a few other fields that aren't really relevant because everyone here is probably an environmental historian. So yeah, and this is a conference I've been going to for a long time, and I really enjoy the Environmental History Conference, and I'm missing it in person this year, but I'm happy we get a chance to talk to you about publishing. Back to you, Andrew.
Bridget, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in first about talking about the process of selecting a press when you have a manuscript or a proposal ready to submit, or even when you just want to talk to an editor about a potential project. My best advice is always just to look at your bookshelf and see who's publishing the books that you're using most frequently. And related to that, you should be looking at your works cited bibliography for your projects. So your dissertation, journal articles, other projects you're working on. So if you keep citing the same presses over and over again, it's probably a good indication that those presses would be a good fit for your work. And you should also think about who's publishing the new books in environmental history that you're excited about. So keep in mind that presses do change their focus of their publishing lists as time goes on. So someone who's publishing a book, 10 years ago that you liked may have changed a little bit. So it's good to keep up to date on what presses are publishing. And an easy way to do that is by going to book exhibits at conferences like ASEH. Obviously, we can't be in person this year, so you can't wander through the book exhibit, but there is one on the website. So if you go to the ASCH website, there's a list of presses who are participating, and then you can link from there to individual exhibit pages on those presses websites. And that's a good way just to see the new and recent environmental history titles that we're publishing. So once you have some presses selected that you're interested in, how do you actually make contact with a real live editor like us? I think I can speak hopefully for everyone on the panel when I say that editors are super nice people. We're really friendly. A major component of our job is talking to authors and potential authors. So we're always very happy to hear from you. An easy way to connect is around a conference. So if you're planning to attend ASCH, reach out to an editor a couple weeks ahead of time, tell them who you are, what you're working on, that you want to set up a meeting, learn more about the press. If you're not attending, or years like this where we can't attend in person, still feel free to email us, just give us an indication of what you're working on. We're happy to chat on the phone, over Zoom. It can get really long and boring at conferences if we don't have people to talk to. So if you're in the book exhibit and you see us maybe chatting with each other or looking bored, please stop by and talk to us. We like hearing about people's projects. That's, I think, the best part of my job is talking to people about their research and their work. So we're always happy to do that. I would also say, don't be afraid to reach out early. If you're in the first few years of your dissertation process, if you're in the early stages of working on a book project, you're still conceptualizing, you can still talk to us about it. We like to talk to people early. I think it's good if you have a sense of what the process is going to be down the road. We can tell you about submitting a proposal, what the process will be, what we're looking for, and also give you some feedback on your project too, if you're in the early stages. So don't be afraid to reach out, even if you don't have anything really concrete yet. So once you have some projects, or you have a project in mind and you're ready for the proposal stage, I think a lot of people tend to get really overwhelmed when they sit down to write the book proposal, but it's a pretty straightforward document, and I don't think it should be that stressful for people. Every press has slightly different components, what they like to see in a proposal, so you should definitely check out each press's website just to see what they're looking for. And this, again, is a good thing to talk to editors about when you're having that initial conversation. We can tell you what we want to see in a proposal, tell you sort of the specifics of what we're looking for. That being said, though, we're not super picky about it. I'm not going to toss out a proposal because you forgot some component or you have an extra one that we didn't ask for. So as long as you have the main elements of a proposal together, you'll be fine. So you always want to conclude some sort of cover letter, email with your proposal. This is a good place to put in your elevator pitch for your project, as well as how your project fits with the press. So if there's, recent books the press has published that you think overlap well with your project or that you're particularly excited about, if there's a specific series that you're interested in at the press, that's good to include in your cover letter. So for the proposal itself, you want to lead off with a good basic description of your project. And usually I'm looking for like a 1 to 2 page overview description of it. You'll want to include something in the proposal about how your project fits in the historiography, how it fits to the field. And then we also like to see just a list or some titles of competing and comparable books. And from the press's perspective, this is more from a marketing standpoint, so we can see how other presses are promoting or situating similar titles. So don't get too caught up in trying to compare your book to bestsellers or, it's really just more of an internal function for us to have that information. The most important component, I think, of the proposal is chapter abstracts. So if you can give us a good solid paragraph or two on what you're going to cover in each chapter in your book project, that is especially helpful for us to get a better sense of what you're actually dealing with in the book. Other components to include are production details, how long you think the book will be. And if you can give that to us in word count rather than book pages, that's helpful. So we don't have to try and guess what font you're using, try and judge that from. Timeline to completion of a complete manuscript. If you're still early in the process, just give us an estimate on when you think you might have a full manuscript ready. Some presses like to see a sample bibliography. I'm always interested in knowing what primary sources you're using for a project. So I'm always interested to see, either a list or a brief description of those kinds of sources. Please include a CV. A lot of people forget to include that, some kind of resume, biography, something, just so we know who you are, where you're coming from, where you're at. And then a writing sample or sample chapter. And again, this will vary a little bit press to press. I always tell people don't include your introduction as your sample chapter, just because I feel so much of the introductory material is included in the proposal itself. So I like to see a different chapter as your writing sample. And again, like I said, it varies a little bit. I'm not super picky with this. If you're early in a project and you don't have chapters written yet, that's also fine. But it's something you'll want to talk to individual presses about for that. And keep in mind that proposals are not set in stone. So you can change material once you get into the writing process. Even though you said in your proposal, chapter 4 is going to cover X, Y, and Z. If you get into it and it doesn't cover that, that's totally fine. So don't get stressed out about that part of the process. We do see some common sort of pitfalls, mistakes come up with proposals pretty frequently. And I think one of the biggest is not having a good statement of your argument in the proposal. This comes up most often when you're revising dissertation to book. Since we find with the dissertation, you tend to maybe have a little bit more of a sprawling argument, a lot of elements to it. So when you're writing a book proposal, you really want to make sure you get that down into a succinct, strong statement of your argument. So that's something really to work on when you're putting together the proposal. Simultaneous submission for proposals is generally fine for most presses, definitely is for Nebraska, but you should definitely include that information in your cover letter or somewhere in the proposal that you've sent it out to other presses. I often tell people that you'll probably get a quicker response if you tell editors that they're competing for your project. So little insider tip there. So make sure to include that. And like we said before, editors are here to help you and we want the best project possible. So if you're struggling with your proposal, if you're having problems putting it together, we're always happy to help in those early stages, give you feedback on drafts and to help you get the proposal into best shape possible before you submit it. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Andrew.
So I'm going to talk about the different types of books that you may want to get published. I want to share some tips for conceptualizing these and let you know how publishers think about them. Specifically, revised dissertations, second books, books for classroom adoption. I'm going to start though by talking about a book type that people often think will be the least amount of work, but is in fact one of the trickiest to pull off. That is the edited volume. Publishers have a love-hate relationship with edited volumes. They can be a great way to get cutting-edge work out fast. They can be groundbreaking. They can be a great way to drive interdisciplinary conversations. The downside is that they're often uneven in terms of quality and thematic organization. And readers will complain that only 3 or 4 essays in the book fit their needs. A good edited volume is designed to be read from beginning to end, unlike an issue of a journal where the reader is going to skip around. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about an edited volume is that it's going to be easy. How hard could it be? But there's a lot that can and will go wrong. Before I get to that though, let me step back and tell you what you need to be able to tell a publisher about pitching an edited volume. You need to be able to answer, what is the rationale for doing an edited volume rather than a single author book on the topic? Why is a collective conversation uniquely useful? Then in the proposal, answer these questions. What makes the book coherent and cohesive? What premise has moved forward through each additional chapter? How are key concepts developed through each essay? How are individual chapters in conversation with each other? Will the authors have a common set of prompts or questions to address? And I want to give a quick shout out to my colleagues Laura McLaughlin and Lori Hagman, who have asked me these same questions almost verbatim in the past couple months about some of the edited volumes I'm working on. You should also expect a conversation with your publisher about inclusion and representation. And I'm not sure there's the equivalent of the word manel for an edited volume, but you don't want to do that. Okay, so I'm going to circle back to the idea that an edited volume is never as easy as you think it's going to be. Problems include people are late. Life happens. Does the book move on without a late contributor? Does the book still succeed as an intellectual project without that person's essay? You'll have to decide. The next problem is contributors are turning work that isn't very good. It's almost a rite of passage for volume editors to get a submission from a senior scholar that they admire and their draft is just terrible. Or if a good friend you recruited to join you writes an essay, it's also not very good. You as the volume editor fall into the awkward spot of telling them that it's not good enough, or you're gonna have to help them fix it. So if you do want to pursue an edited volume, my advice is loop in an editor quickly who can help you develop the project and navigate these hurdles. Next, revised dissertation. So there's a myth that publishers and editors don't like these, and it's hard to get presses to publish them. And this comes from, where this comes from is that the topic of a first book is often perceived as being narrow, that the author doesn't have the same name recognition as a senior scholar, and converting the dissertation into a book is often more work than authors anticipate. Sometimes this is true, sometimes it's not. We can all give examples of a revised dissertation that's won the Bancroft, but that's not the norm. What I find alarming is when a junior scholar pitches a revised dissertation and they say, you know, I wrote my dissertation as a book. It just needs a few tweaks. That's almost never true that it just needs a few tweaks. I'd rather hear that a scholar plans to take a wrecking ball to their project and they need an extra year or 2 or 3 to get it done right. There are a couple of good books on converting a dissertation into a book. I trust these are names that you know already. Beth Louie, Revising Your Dissertation, William Germano from Dissertation to Book. If you're going to go this route, these are books that are definitely worth your time. A few quick tips. You may have already heard the truism that it's not enough in environmental history to just be environmental. And I think it's safe to say that most editors want to know how your work engages with social movements, social inequalities, questions around racism and other social inequalities. I also want to circle back to something that Bridget mentioned about how many people who pitching revised dissertations don't often have a good statement of their argument. What I would say is that when you're preparing your proposal, make sure that your original argument and your original contribution is on the first page of your proposal, if not the first few paragraphs. Don't bury what's new in your summary of other people's works. Next, I want to talk about second books and beyond. In one sense, the same advice for a first book applies to the second, vice versa. Minimize jargon, prioritize what's new, be a storyteller. The difference between a revised dis and a second book is partially an author's professional location, that you have more freedom to go your own way, less pressure to do something safe, maybe to go for a broader readership. If you want to go for a broader readership, think about the fact that you need a charismatic topic, something that's exciting to read about. You also need urgency. At this moment, we're facing a climate crisis, the rise of the carceral state, lots of problems. What historical topics can inform those present-day conversations? We don't want to be presentist, but when thinking about topics, as I heard another historian say recently, brainstorm about opportunities for what might be called present-minded history, because that's what people want to read. When you talk to the publisher, be concrete in talking about the audience. It's not enough to say general educated readers or NPR listeners will want to read my book. Point to recent books that speak to a similar audience as yours will, show how those are your readers too, but even more importantly, show what kind of media covered that and show that your book is a credible candidate to get that same kind of coverage. Please don't ever point to a book that sold 1 million copies or even 100,000 copies. That's just not useful for us to work with at all. If you want to write more consciously for general readers in your second book, you also need to think about the steps you need to take to get there. When a scholar tells me they want to write for general readers, the first thing I'm going to ask is, what general interest publications have you published in? Are you writing for Grist, High Country News, newspapers? Are you publishing op-eds? Taking those kinds of first steps to build up to a book project will help you build name recognition, but the editing you receive at general interest venues will help hone your skill set to eventually write a book that general readers will love. Next, I want to talk about when you're pitching a book and you want to emphasize that it would be good for course use. Just because you've written a good piece of scholarship, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a strong candidate for classroom adoption. When you write a proposal, what publishers are looking for is a thoughtful explanation of why your book would be appropriately matched to the current classroom market. Course adoption is really competitive, especially the big survey classes like US History 1865 to now. Yes, there's a lot of those classes, but your book is competing with every prize-winning history book ever published. And I can't speak for everyone on the panel, but most of our classroom adoptions will be in upper division undergraduate classes or graduate classes. So rather than saying that your book is for everybody, publishers prefer that you be very specific and say what somebodies will need your book. I'd rather someone say, here are 15 schools that teach a regular climate change and society class than someone who says vaguely, oh, it could be used in a survey class taught at every single college in the country. So what I want to know is, how does your book or your proposed book track with the way the classes are taught? How does it overlap with common themes that people use in organizing those classes week by week? Can you make the case that your book will be taught in its entirety rather than just a single chapter? And not least, is your book fun? Is it infuriating, eye-popping, inspirational? Instructors want books that students will engage with, and that means your writing and storytelling has to be engaging too. Every press also has access to their own mailing list we built up over the years, as well as commercial lists to buy to reach readers. But if you can also point us to specific listservs, Facebook groups, and otherwise where to find people teaching these courses that your book would be right for, that's great. Because rather than spamming the entire universe, most publishers would rather contact fewer people who are more likely to be interested in your book, especially. Brian, over to you.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Everyone's so organized and on topic. It's very impressive. I'm going to be speaking about peer review, which is something that gets a scary rap, and for good reason. It's it's an intense process that we as editors kind of are managing, but it shouldn't be a scary process. And I think there's ongoing discussions to really figure out how to make it as useful as possible and as fair as possible. And many of us, as your editors, and I think this is a theme that Bridget certainly kicked off with, we are approachable, and this includes in the review process. Speak to us about the process, talk about your fears in the process, and we can give information. I'll give information now, but in personal conversations, we can also give information that might offset some of those concerns. And different presses conduct peer review differently, but most scholarly presses, most scholarly presses do it. All university presses, it's kind of the gold standard. So university presses are all using peer review. If you're really interested, the Association of University Presses actually has a best practices for peer review, which is kind of getting the weeds. But the point is just that in preparing that document, I think there's a realization that we're all doing something pretty similar. So I'll talk here about what I do and what most of my colleagues do, but again, similar to what Bridget said, there might be variations, and we can discuss that. And yeah, I think the conversations around peer review, a lot of them right now that a lot of us are having, are about making it more equitable as well, and thinking through, because the challenges historically, there are some problems where peer review could kind of dampen some innovation happening in scholarship if you have senior scholars telling junior scholars, no, it has to be like this. So I think we're aware of that as editors and trying to figure out how to bring out the strengths of a project, which might be innovative in different ways, whether format or content or subject areas, interdisciplinary, and we're kind of mindful of that going forward. And it's a conversation that I think is really important and that is ongoing, and that can happen on a personal level as well. And this goes back to something Andrew said, to say it's really important you have a good sense of your book and be ready to suggest reviewers, possibly. A lot of us are very open to hearing suggestions of peer reviewers because it gives us a sense, and this can be even as early as a proposal stage, and I'll talk about the process. When I hear a list of reviewers from an author, it gives me a sense of, okay, this is the kind of constellation of scholars this author is putting themselves in. So think carefully about who the audience is for your book. And again, Andrew was just saying the kind of profile for your book. If you have a book that you think is great for classroom adoption, then think about other scholars that have done books that are great for classroom adoption in your field. They're the ones that should be reviewing it. If it's a professional book, kind of handbook, if it's a monograph, if it's a crossover book, sometimes there's scholars who come in and say, name these huge names in your field, like the top names of people writing for the New Yorker, people writing, and say, that should be the one who reviews my book. And it's a scholarly monograph. First of all, you don't want them to review your manuscript, probably, because you're probably not at the standard they're at, because they've been doing this and because they're writing for the audiences, Andrew said, that are, these crossover audiences. And if you're doing a scholarly monograph, that's fine. Reviewers should be people who know the scholarship and support that kind of publication, again, to draw out the strengths of your project, rather than try to turn a monograph into a general interest book, which is really heavy lifting and can be a fairly painful process. So you should also have a sense of, your book to recommend reviewers, but you should also feel comfortable, and this is increasingly happening, I think, and editors are increasingly open to it, feel comfortable saying who shouldn't review your book, your manuscript, or your materials. And there doesn't have to be a reason given. Sometimes you have someone in mind for, again, any number of reasons that you think you might. I've had authors say to me, you might think of this person, I'd rather that person not review my material. And sometimes they give a reason, but they don't have to. And it's fine. There's enough people to review it that I don't want someone who has some kind of issue already, who, to be a particularly harsh and unfair reviewer, or you have a personal situation with. I don't need to know. I want someone who's going to give the project as fair a reading as possible and strengthen the project. So it's totally fair to just ask someone to be kept off that list. I typically, if an author gives me a list of reviewers, I typically don't go for more than one person off the list, though again, I avoid anyone people ask me to avoid. But for a full manuscript going out to 2 people, I should try to have one person who's someone from my list who I contact, and maybe one person from a list and author contacts if I feel like they're the right reviewers. I will also say I typically try to get reviewers who have published one book, but sometimes in a field, especially interdisciplinary in a newly emerging field, sometimes the best scholar is someone who hasn't published a book. But the kind of quick and easy qualification is they've been through this process and they've published a book, and that's someone who can review a manuscript. That's not always the case, but that has been the standard. I think it's changing more and more because of the challenge of having the same kind of senior scholars always reviewing manuscripts. So just to go through the process quickly that I go through for a proposal and sample materials, if it's part of a series like our Environmental History of the Northeast series, if a project is proposed for that series, or I think it fits that series, then I send it to the series editors. At my press, if the editors feel comfortable and evaluate a project thoroughly enough, for me, I feel like I can make the case to my director to say we should put it under advanced contract. Sometimes a series editor will say, this looks great, but I don't know this particular, aspect, this aspect of our field, this area, this subfield, whatever, well enough. I think you should have this person or this person read it. So then I'll send it to an outside reader, the series editors, at the series editor's suggestion. And I typically let authors know that. It goes out to an outside reader. This is also the process if a proposal comes in not for a series. I typically will take a look at it. I'll look at proposals as an editor in the field, not a scholar, but I can look at things like the really practical information. Is there information about word count and illustration count, the things Bridget was talking about that should be in a proposal? I can see if the writing is, needs some work, if there's any kind of sloppiness that I think it's best to take care of before it goes out to readers, because then they'll talk about the punctuation being wrong instead of the content of it. I can see if the organization, there's things I can evaluate as an editor, but then there's things a scholar is going to take a look at in terms of the scholarship in the field, and if it's up to date in those scholarly conversations. So when I send out the proposal and sample chapters, I don't send out a questionnaire, but I do say, how viable is this project? How much does it participate in current conversations? And I ask for feedback within 4 weeks. Doesn't always happen, but that's what I ask for. And I will chase it after 4 weeks, but then I send them the feedback, which might be a few paragraphs by email. Again, it's an early stage of review. I share it with the author and I might ask for a response if they're mentioning suggestions. And the best case scenario, the feedback is useful. That's what we want in the peer review. It is, oh, there's a book that's coming out next year that I happen to know about, the author should know about. There's this article they might have missed. There's questions that are really useful for you to think through. Sometimes in a proposal, they might suggest things you're already doing, but they don't know because they don't have that chapter. And that's okay. But we want it to be a productive conversation. So the author can respond to that, and I can use that kind of conversation we're having in requesting an advanced contract. And yes, there can be reviews that are so negative that it ends the conversation. But chances are, even if they have some negative questions, there are negative suggestions, some things that are going wrong, it might mean I'm not committing to it at this stage, but I still want to see it when it's done. It's not usually not a yes or no. Peer review shouldn't really be a yes or no. It should be more of a conversation and then prompt a conversation for us to have. When the full manuscript comes in, whether it's under advanced contract or not, every manuscript goes out to 2 readers simultaneously. Again, after the series editors take a look at the manuscript, if it's in a series, after I take a look, we decide it's ready to go out for review. I'll let you know if there's something I see that needs to change, or the series editors. And then it goes out to 2 readers simultaneously, maybe a reader if they've seen the proposal, especially if they're excited about the manuscript. And that I usually ask for a response within 8 weeks. Again, doesn't always happen, but that's my request for the full manuscript. They send back a report. I share it with you without their name attached. In both cases, the reviewer's name's not attached. And then I ask for a response from you as the author to the reports. And again, typically even if they get negative, it's kind of, this is not a yes or no situation. So, and another thing I'll just say now, I think I should wrap up soon, but another thing I always say to an author is you should maintain ownership of your project. It's your project. So even if these are subjective reports, and sometimes a reviewer comes in and says, they should be including this whole other section that has nothing to do with what you're doing, or completely outside your scope. Maybe that's a bad suggestion. It's fine for you to say that. And I really encourage authors to maintain ownership. And I've had authors who I learned early on that sometimes our faculty board is kind of unimpressed if an author says, I'll do everything they say. The faculty board's like, this person just sounds like they're just going to do everything. They're not really. So I really encourage authors to interact with the reports, push back as appropriate. I supervise that process of writing a letter of response to the reports because I know where it's going. Where it's going is to the faculty board in a packet with the reports. And so, and the faculty board in my case, they're from all over the university. They're not necessarily in the area. They're not reviewing the manuscript. They're really reviewing the process. And so they want to see that there is this kind of, the author really took into account the peer review, really gave it thought, really responded thoughtfully to it, even if the response is, I'm not doing that. One component I'll mention that's become increasingly part of the conversation in terms of how we evaluate things, and peer reviewers, and in our case, certainly, and I know other people at the faculty board, are these questions of inclusion? Are you, yes, and Andrew alluded to this as well. Yes, you're doing environmental history of a certain area or of a certain group or of a certain, but increasingly there's this push to say you really need to think expansively. You look at land acknowledgements, you look at, there's an understanding that if you're talking about even environmental history, you're talking about the land, who is using it, who has access, who doesn't have access, who's doing scholarship. Maybe you're not doing scholarship on a certain group that was, in this area, or had some, at least make reference to scholarship that was done in these areas, even if you feel you can't navigate that world because it's in a different field and you're like, this is what I do. You at least have to cite, you still have to reference that scholarship, and that's increasingly important. And like I said, it comes up with editors reviewing material, but also the peer reviews, our faculty board will say if that comes up in a report, is that being addressed by the author? So I think that's something everyone should be aware of, and really thinking through and being careful about. Think about your sources, think about your archives, think about the kind of social angle of it. As Andrew said, it's important, and typically it's strengthening a project. It's making it more applicable, it's making it more relevant, and it's adding to the project. So it's not a task, a checklist, checklist, make sure you check that off. It's something that increasingly people are seeing as strengthening the scholarship and making the book of more value, so it's worth doing. And I think that's all I'm covering, and hopefully I did not go on too long. And we're ready to pass it over to Neecole.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to give some tips from the perspective of an editorial assistant. So even if you don't ever meet an editorial assistant in person, there's one that will spend many, many hours behind the scenes working on your book project. You may interact with them at different points in the process, but especially when preparing a final manuscript. So I want to talk about a very particular point in the publication process, the point where you, the author, have cleared peer review, finished your manuscript, and now it's time to pass it over to production. But before this happens, you're going to work with acquisitions to clear up any issues like any illustration, permissions, or formatting issues before turning everything over to copy editing. And for most presses, you'll work primarily with the editorial assistant or assistant editor to work through some of these mechanical details. I'm going to share some tips so that you can avoid the most common mistakes authors make when submitting their manuscript. I want to preface that every press is different, so when in doubt, ask your editor. So here are 7 things to remember to be the perfect author for an editorial assistant. Number 1, read the guidelines. Every press has unique guidelines for preparing a book manuscript for production. So make sure you carve out time to thoroughly read through the guidelines your editor gives you, maybe an hour at most. It's like reading a syllabus. So it'll answer any questions you have, and it'll save everyone a ton of work in the long run. Number 2, unless you're told otherwise, ask your editorial assistant first. At this point in the process, we in acquisitions want to get the details packaged up neatly for production. So as you gather your files, you should only communicate with your editorial assistant or acquisitions editor, depending on how your press handles this stage. So not the art director, not the designer, not the copy editor, just acquisitions until you hear otherwise. Number 3, cut epigraphs. It's common authors include epigraphs throughout their manuscript, but 97% of the time they aren't needed. They may seem fun, but often there's so much more work than you probably can imagine. So if the material is covered by copyright, you, the author, will have to track down the rights holder for permission to use, and then also most likely pay the rights holder a fee. So cutting epigraphs will save you a lot of headaches. Number 4, remember images are going to look different once they're printed on the page of a book rather than on your computer screen. So when choosing images, imagine how they'll appear on a page black and white and a page the size of like 6 by 9 inches. And the usable space for that size of a page is usually less than that. So to get a good sense of how that might appear, how the image might appear, is you can just print the image off black and white off of your everyday household printer, but about at 5 by 5 inches. And when you do this, ask yourself, will the content still come through at this resolution? Like, could you use words instead of text to convey the information? Or is this an image someone could easily Google instead? That leads me to number 5, only submit large, high quality digital files for images. Digital files that are 5 by 5 inches at 350 DPI will make everyone happy, especially the editorial assistants. Every time you interact with someone about an image file, like an archivist, remember these magic numbers, 5 by 5 inches at 350 DPI. There's no need to submit a file if it's the size of a postage stamp. Publishers don't say no to images because they don't understand your work or see the value. It's just because they know from experience the image will look terrible on a printed page. So please just remember the size 5 by 5 inches at 350 DPI. Number 6, maps. Maps tend to cause more problems than any other type of image. Getting a map to be attractive and convey the exact right information requires a lot of work. So a press's first choice is for you to often like hire a professional map maker or to reuse a map that's already appeared in another book with permission. Not only do maps have to fit size standards, but they also need to be readable. Often authors submit maps that need a lot of edits, whether it be increasing the font size or using heavier weight lines. Just make sure the map conveys what it needs. And last but not least, number 7, have your permissions ready. Submitting your permissions with the rest of the manuscript is ideal, and it's never too late to start figuring out who are the right holders for your images. Many presses won't send a book to production without completing permissions. This way you can sit back and relax until your manuscript is back from copy editing rather than scrambling to tie things up. So in conclusion, the manuscript prep guidelines that your editor sends you, please read these before the last second. And remember, the editorial assistant is your friend and their job is to answer your questions. So never hesitate to reach out and ask for help. Now on to you, Rachel.
Thanks. I feel like there was so much good stuff in those few minutes that I'm reluctant to follow up with my information. But so I feel like I'm in a unique position because I spent a good deal of time working as a marketing and sales director and have now been in acquisitions for about 4 years. So there's a lot of things that I feel like I can share about the marketing process that I wish I had known when I was just in marketing, because now I have the acquisitions experience, but I feel like I can kind of illuminate some of what to expect. So I find that many authors and editors have a lot of questions about the final end of this process. And unfortunately, marketing of the books is something that's often thought about quite late in the process, and yet is also simultaneously something for which both authors and publishers alike can have really outsized expectations. So I'm going to bring some tips and things for you to kind of consider in these early stages of your book projects. So one of the most important pieces is to recognize that the publishing process is collaborative and that you're working with a team. And for a long time, that team is pretty much your acquisitions editor and or an editorial assistant. If you're working with a small press like mine, your team is a party of me. Or if you're working at a bigger press like Bridget or Andrew, then you might be working with a couple of folks kind of tightly clustered within the acquisitions end of things. But once your book is transmitted to production, your contacts will shift to an editorial manager and likely a designer who will help you through the copy editing, typesetting, and publication processes. But towards the end of that, you'll meet your marketing team. And your marketing team has likely been aware of you and your book for a long time, sometimes even years. Oftentimes projects, especially if they're advance contracted, are shared with the full staff, even when the submission of the manuscript is many years off into the future. So while these are new contacts for you, you are not always a new contact for them. Ideally, that team will have kind of a leader. Sometimes that's the marketing and sales director, who will orient you to the folks that you're going to be working with within that department. But it's also okay to ask for kind of a full introduction to that department staff if that's not offered to you. Because sometimes a marketing department in a small press can be 1, maybe 2 people. Sometimes at a bigger press, it can be 6 to 10, depending on what the staff allocations look like. And it's important to note that once you're kind of introduced to this new team of people, there's not a lot of utility in circling back to your acquisitions editor. So you will have a marketing contact, and that's the person to send stuff to. I love to know what you're up to as your book has been published and those reviews are coming through, but we do have mechanisms internally for those notifications. So you can just share information with your marketing team as you're introduced to them. And marketing is usually considered the last stage of the publishing process, but it's one that you can begin preparing for much earlier in the process. And that kind of early preparation work will save you a lot of time and energy down the road. Most presses, if not every press, will ask for a marketing questionnaire, which is a document that asks everything from how to contact you to your preferred pronouns to like the review outlets that you're interested in, awards that need to be submitted to. And you can just go ahead and start collecting that information as early in the process as feels comfortable. You can ask your editor to share with you the template for the marketing document, or you can just start drafting a Google Doc with kind of your own thoughts listed there. Most of us hear the word or phrase promotion and think of a few really specific things like author events, book reviews, and social media. But the reality is that there are lots of ways to promote scholarly books. And so it's important for authors to be flexible, both with your own abilities and the abilities of your press, because promotion plans can look really different depending on if your marketing department is a team of 6 or a single individual. And it's really important to note that I said that department might look different, not be better, because most books rely much more heavily on one person in the department than all 6, both for their primary point of contact and for the promotions that build from those efforts. So don't assume that a bigger marketing department is going to promote your book better than a smaller marketing department necessarily. It's also important to note that as authors, we are not equally suited to all kinds of promotions. And I find this to be a really important thing to remind folks of when it comes to social media. I have a social media presence on Twitter, but I don't have any other social media presence. I'm not a huge social media person. And that's kind of true for many folks, especially in higher education and some of these scholarly disciplines. So I've had a lot of authors say, okay, should I get on Twitter and start promoting my book? And if you want to, yeah, that would be great. But if Twitter is not your wheelhouse, or you're not particularly keen on social media, the effort that goes into creating that profile and building the audiences that you're going to be talking with can't be done quickly, and it might not necessarily be worth the energy that goes into it. Most of the social media users that are doing big promotional work have been active online for a very long time and have really established communities. And they've amassed a lot of followers, and they've really laid the groundwork for their publications. So if you're 6 months out from your pub date and you aren't on social media, that is okay. It means it might not be the right space for you to promote your book. So with that in mind, it's important to think about where the spaces are that you and your book will be a good fit. And some of the things I like to suggest people think about early is, what are the conferences you attend regularly, or the conferences you wish you could attend regularly? Because I think it's important to note that when we talk about scholar, we mean a wide variety of things. That can mean someone at an R1, that can mean someone at a community college, that can mean contingent faculty, that can mean grad students, and that can mean independent scholars. So knowing that we don't all have the resources to be at every conference, it's okay to think about the ones where you see yourself intellectually and where you see your book fitting intellectually. To that end, it's also important to think about the colleagues who might be interested in teaching some or all of your book. As Andrew mentioned, rarely are books taught in their entirety, but it's okay to think about, if you've got a couple of chapters that could be a really good fit in certain courses, you can segment out your book and think about it kind of creatively in those different spaces. And keep track of those colleagues' names and emails so that you or your press can notify them at publication with an offer of an exam or desk copy. It can also be nice for scholars to send a bulk email to those contacts and ask them to request the book at their institutional and/or public libraries so that the research is available for all audiences. I think this can be a challenging time to reach out to colleagues and ask them to put their money into our books, but we can suggest that our libraries do that. And then it's also a more collective resource. So I like to encourage that. I think it's also useful to keep track of media contacts that you've been in touch with at both scholarly and general reader publications that might want to review your work. That's something where I think a lot of us think like, well, I don't have any media contacts, but if you think about it, you actually probably do have some. They may not be at the New York Times, like, let's be honest, they probably aren't, but they could be at your local newspaper or at in a organizer of a listserv. So think about media a little more creatively. Also, don't forget your alumni organizations and the news offices at your current institutions. I usually recommend that folks do that labor directly, because those contacts want to talk to you. They want to know what you're doing. They don't really want to know what your press is doing. So I oftentimes found in my role in marketing, if I was reaching out to alumni organizations, it was rarely an answered question, but if the author did it, they usually got kind of solicited because they're using that as fundraising tools and marketing efforts, and you are their resource. It's also useful to think about op-eds in both general reader publications and also in higher education venues. These oftentimes have a lot of traction, and there are a good deal of work to prepare for. If it does feel like it's a good fit for you, I would encourage you to read a lot of op-eds and get a really solid feel for the tone and where your message and argument fits into the conversation based on your topic, field, or discipline. Andrew touched on this too, and it's really key, kind of thinking about how to position yourself within these larger general reader venues. We've also always all seen those op-eds that get lambasted. My other big discipline that I work in is rhetoric and composition, writing studies. And inside higher ed or the Chronicle, like every week there's a scholar in some discipline saying, I've solved the question of college writing. And then like everyone in the discipline freaks out because there's disciplines that are asking those questions and doing that work. So you want to be aware of those larger conversations across disciplines, because a big public hot take probably isn't going to do you a whole lot of good, generally speaking. It's also important to think about where your book sits and what the expectations are for audience, like Andrew mentioned earlier. Some books are geared toward general readers and/or courses, and others are monographs that are oriented toward scholarly audiences. And both types of books are not only okay, like they're more than okay. It's okay to be what the book is. I think it's a lot more important for a book to successfully be what it is than to set expectations that are out of alignment with the book and fail to reach those goals. Monographs, I mean, we all kind of have comparable monograph sales. We're looking at 200, 250 copy sales if things are going well. But I think it's a real mistake to kind of gauge success based on those sales numbers, because the scholarly monograph is occupying a really crucial space within this higher education space, and those books are succeeding in their own ways. So some of my favorite books that I've worked on are titles that sat cleanly in the scholarly monograph space, and the authors knew that they were talking to other scholars, and with their book, they extended a conversation that's providing a foundation for new scholarship in both scholarly areas and in trade work. So I know that we're in the waning moments. I'm just going to mention two more quick things. Book reviews tend to be a place of a lot of focus for authors. And I just wanted to share that most popular media venues bring books into their reviewing timelines pre-publication. And that usually happens 6 months before the book is published. So if it's 3 months after your pub date and the New York Times hasn't reviewed it, they're not going to. But if they did, you should immediately tell us all of your secrets to success, because we would love to know. On the other hand, scholarly media like journals will definitely review well beyond those timelines. And we've all seen journals review a book 5 years after publication. So be patient with that process. Know that reviews will take a long time to unfold. And it's also important to remember that your book can only be actively marketed for so long. At a certain point, you will kind of transition out of the active engagement portion of the marketing department's work. We know that most of a book's successes will happen in the first year of its publication, and more accurately, even within the first 3 to 4 months of its publication. So publishers are going to keep putting out new books. And after the first year, your publisher may not send out as many review copies, even if they've been requested. Though if NPR calls, we're always going to send a book. And after a few years, there's going to be less space for your book on the table at key conferences, because that space is going to be supporting new titles and new scholars who are emerging in the discipline. And that's an important thing to remember, is that you're part of a larger ecosystem. So I feel like a theme kind of emerged from this panel, which is really know your book. And that feels important in this marketing end of things as well, that you have to understand your identity as a scholar and your book's potential and where those successes are going to be for you. And through that process, be flexible, be communicative, and be ready to think creatively as you go through the work. So I guess now, Andrew, we'll do some general questions.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And thank you, everyone, for who has been submitting questions in the Q&A and in the chat section. If you have more, keep those coming. And I believe we have about another 15 minutes with the panelists to answer questions before it is kindergarten pickup. But maybe we can start working through some of these questions right now. Bridget, I'm going to ask you first a question here in the chat, in the Q&A. Did you say it was okay to submit proposals to 2 presses simultaneously?
Yes, for sure. And again, you might want to check with individual presses, but I would say the vast majority of presses are fine with simultaneous submission and review at the proposal stage.
And for these next questions, maybe I'll just call on each of us individually, unless you guys want to pick out questions to answer. I can just assign one to each of you and we'll walk through these.
Sure.
So Brian, I'll let you answer this. This is a question that came up both in the Q&A and also in the chat. The question is, since a manuscript never feels ready, at what point should a scholar submit the proposal? And over in the chat, somebody asked a very similar question. They said, is there a recommendation on where an author should be in manuscript preparation when they send a proposal letter? For example, should an author already be working actively on the manuscript when sending the proposal?
Yeah, these are good questions, and I think I'll go back to Bridget's point about talking to editors early. So certainly, in terms of conversations, don't wait till you're actively. You don't have to wait till you're actively involved in a full manuscript. But for the proposal, I would say you should be, that their manuscript should be in process. And usually, when I talk to a scholar at a conference and they say I'm in early stages, I'll say at some point it's more useful for our conversation to have material. And the material usually is a proposal. And I mean, ideally, an ideal package to me is a proposal in 2 sample chapters, or maybe an introduction and a sample chapter, just to get a sense of the project, get a sense of the writing. That's useful to me. When you have a proposal, I have had proposals where they show up and I say, is there sample writing? And people say that it's not available yet, which I find a little confusing because I can't really do much just with a proposal. And a sample writing should be at least one full complete chapter, not an article you've published or a chapter from a dissertation you plan to revise. You want to put your best foot forward. So have a chapter that maybe you sent out to other people's, your own peers, whether it's people in your cohort or your university, if you have a job, and there's people that can. So I'm not the first one looking at it. I'm outside of advisors or something. I've had people send me something, and then when I give feedback saying this still reads like a dissertation, they'll say, "Oh, I know. I thought I'd get feedback," and it's like you don't want that to come directly from me, at least not at first, because now it's part of your permanent record. That's why I just think of it. You want it. If you can go ahead and get it all cleaned up before you send it to me, then the peer reviewers aren't doing that work, and I'm not seeing that feedback, so that's useful. In terms of the full manuscript, I think it's something similar. It's kind of only you can know when the manuscript's ready to submit, when you feel like it's ready to go, but I would recommend I had a faculty member actually on my campus, because I do some faculty advising as well on my campus, and they had an editor at a university press, I believe they're under contract, send them back, say to them when they submitted their manuscript, why don't you have some people read this before you submit it? And they were kind of taken aback, but I actually thought it was good advice to say, again, don't have the first eyes on it, be your editor and peer reviewers. Are there people you trust in your field who you feel comfortable enough sharing that material, kind of conducting your own peer review, essentially, so you get that feedback before it goes to a press. So I would say that maybe if you have an opportunity to share the material, sometimes a chapter with someone who knows that area, sometimes a whole manuscript if you have a really generous colleague, to have someone take a look at it, so when you're submitting it, it's been through some sort of kind of informal review amongst your people you know and trust.
Because I do think that sometimes there's an assumption that we can function as developmental editors for manuscripts, particularly in bridging that space between the dissertation and the monograph. But most of us are acquiring and transmitting a pretty sizable number of projects every year. And so for me, I do not always have the luxury of reading a full manuscript, particularly if it's in an early draft form. Like I'm kind of dipping in key places and evaluating, and then we'll read more fully with the peer reviews to provide some context. So it's definitely a good idea to use your network of peers to kind of get you to that first stage of the manuscript.
Rachel, I'm going to ask you this next question. This is in the chat. Is there anything different that independent or unaffiliated scholars need to do to improve their chances of publication?
So for me, I don't think so. Our press is really interested in working with a broad swath of folks. And so I am regularly reading work from independent scholars, contingent faculty, and really embrace that more inclusive idea of what scholarship constitutes. So I think that one of the places where independent scholars can really face a hurdle is in access to resources in the research phase. And so I have had a number of independent scholars kind of say up front, I don't really have access to a research institutional library at this point. So there may be some gaps in some of my primary research or bibliography, and that can be something we can talk about and kind of strategize as we go. But on the whole, I think that we're just as interested in your research as that of someone at an R1.
And I would just add to that that it's hopefully you're comfortable enough to be upfront about any delays that might be in place. I've had people say to me, look, this is my teaching load, or I'm struggling on the job market or whatever, and maybe there's no reason you need to give, but just that, maybe you have an advanced contract where you say, okay, we want the full manuscript, and they say it's going to take 2 years, and people get self-conscious about it, but I think you should be upfront. We understand we're right here with you on campuses and in this world, so we know that labor is a real challenge right now, that there's real challenges to, personal and professional reasons, there might be a delay, and hopefully you're comfortable, acknowledging that rather than putting unrealistic deadlines in because you feel pressure and then, you can't meet them.
Next, I see 2 questions in the Q&A that overlap, and I will answer these. What's the role of an agent in the publishing process? How helpful are they to presses and authors? And another question is, how does the information you provided also apply to commercial publishers that publish environmental history? And what sort of compensation do publishers offer for books of this sort, if any? I would say that we do, I'll speak for my press, we do occasionally work with agents, but honestly, it's not very common. And the reason is that if you're a literary agent, you are going to take 15% of what the author makes from the book. And in order for 15% of what an author makes from the book to be enough money to justify your time, you need an author that's going to be selling at least 10,000 or 20,000 copies to make it worthwhile. And so again, I can't speak for everybody's presses here. I would say occasionally we do work with agents. It's rare because agents are usually shooting for bigger fish, for books that are going to have a lot more sales than what we're talking about here. Maybe if you were talking to an Ivy League press about publishing a book, I imagine they deal a lot more with agents, or if you're talking to a New York City publisher, agents are also going to be a lot more important there. As for what kind of compensation, if it's a book that's going to be an academic book, you're going to get the conventional academic royalties, which, to be honest, are not very much. If it's really important to you that you receive an advance for a project or a sizable advance, you really want to be thinking about talking to an agent, and to set yourself up for an agent, really you want to have a track record of already publishing in general interest publications. And oftentimes, I mean, one of the best ways to get an agent is to publish so much in general interest publication that the agent actually comes to you. They say, hey, I see you're out writing fascinating stuff day after day. Could I represent you? And really, that's so much better than having to, write 100 different agents a query letter. For the next question, I'm going to throw this to Bridget. Is it common for editors or acquisitions managers to contact scholars and writers about publishing, or should we be wary of these inquiries?
I contact people all the time about publishing with us. It's really common around conferences. You'll probably start getting some emails from editors who have looked through a conference program and seen your name. I go through ProQuest a lot too, looking at dissertation abstracts, find things that look interesting, look like a good fit. There are some sketchy academic publishers out there who will email people about publishing, so beware of those. But if you get an email from an editor at a university press, that's a really good thing.
Thank you. Brian, here's a question I'll pass to you, since you also spoke about peer review. This is from the chat. Thanks for the great discussion. Is the editor the one who makes the call on whether to accept a submitted manuscript, or the peer reviewers? And then what role does the faculty board have?
The editors are kind of this gatekeeper function that gets discussed a lot. I mean, we are the ones that decide what to send out for peer review. And so if I get something and, someone submits something on an anthropology, we don't do anthropology. And so that will not go out for peer review from me because I don't know that world and we're not doing it. If it's a field I know, then yes, and if it's our list, then I will say this looks, if it's unsolicited, if I haven't written to you, as Bridget said, if there hasn't been a conversation, but it's something appropriate, it just comes in, then I will let you know this is appropriate. Like I said, I would give feedback if there's anything for me to give feedback on in terms of the materials, and then let you know if I think it's ready to go out for peer review. And then basically, I think of myself as the one who's making sure the project gets a fair hearing. Is it going to be evaluated fairly? So sometimes you get a peer review that's incredibly negative. That's unfair. It does happen. And we try to look out for that. And maybe we have to get another review to offset it, maybe, but we try to be fair. And sometimes if I can tell a peer review wasn't done fairly, then, or if a peer review, frankly, is really good, but really thin, that might also be a case where it's like, this is great, but we just need more. I'm overseeing that process to make sure the project's being truly evaluated. So the peer reviewers, I would say, it's not kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down. It's usually more nuanced than that. And we're the ones that kind of decide on whether it's going forward. Of course, peer reviewers, a full manuscript goes out to 2 reviewers, they don't see each other's review. So you have no idea, this report could be really strong, this one could be mixed, both strong, whatever there could be. That's why it's a more nuanced process that the editors are overseeing. We are then presenting the project to the faculty board, and this varies according to the press. At my press, we have a small enough number of projects, we do about 40 books a year, that every project gets discussed by our faculty board. And ultimately they vote. And so I decide if it's ready to go to the faculty board, I decide if it needs more support, it needs better review, it needs, or if it's ready to go, like I said, I work with authors on their letters to make sure they're kind of doing what I feel like the board would want them to do, responding thoroughly. And then the faculty board does ultimately vote on publication. But for most editors, I would say you can have that conversation to say, I think it's fairly rare for a press to say the faculty board makes the final, the faculty board doesn't see every project that comes across our desk. We choose what to bring to the faculty board. So yes, there's cases where a faculty board can stop a publication, but I think there's just, the editor is really the one who's managing the process and using the peer reviews and the faculty board to make the project the best it can be to strengthen it the most we can.
So next here is we have a comment that went to the panelist. I don't know if everybody else can see this, but it was specifically directed to Neecole, who said, the person wanted to say, thank you very much for the advice to cut epigraphs, and asked, why couldn't you have told me this 3 months ago? And the reason is that this poor scholar is now trapped in a copyright daymare. And it sounds like this scholar can't wait to go home tonight and just cut the epigraph and make everybody much happier. So good work, Neecole. So Rachel, here's a question that I want to direct to you. When turning your dissertation into a book, would it be an issue if the university makes the dissertation available in open access?
So this is a timely question because I just got an email this week from a university where a scholar had embargoed their dissertation in the hopes of revising it and publishing it with our press. And I got kind of a weirdly aggressive email from the company doing the dissertation platform, asking me to prove to them why we would not want to have the dissertation made available open access. It was all very weird. So I forwarded it to our director and we're going to have a chat and get his thoughts about it. I don't think that this falls into deal breaker territory because we want to see such significant revisions from the dissertation to the monograph that arguably that's one thing and this is another. It's a different genre. But at the same time, it would be nice not to have that in the mix. And I know from my marketing and sales background that if there's a whiff of revised dissertation, you really do get impact in terms of your sales. Library buys go down drastically. And there's kind of a sense that maybe that has been covered already. So in general, I would like not to see those available open access through these university platforms. But if that happened, it would certainly not mean the end of the conversation. But I'm super curious about other folks' processes too, because I don't have a very clear-cut answer for that one.
I would say same. I agree with that. I think, I mean, it's better if it's not available open access, but if it is, then we definitely need evidence that you're making significant revisions to it.
And just go ahead and change that title. Like you might have nailed
Title, that's what I was
Yes.
going to say, the same
Yes.
thing.
but you need to just move on and find the next great iteration.
Yeah,
Such
and
a
don't
heartbreak
include
for some
anything
people.
about the dissertation in your acknowledgements.
Here's a question in the Q&A. Any advice for, and this, I'll answer this one. Any advice for working parents returning to the manuscript after much time off? I have two reactions to that. First of all, if you're coming back to the manuscript and you haven't touched it in a year or 2 years, that is an incredible strength. You're going to be able to see it with much fresher eyes than you would have otherwise. The second suggestion I would give to somebody who knows that they're about to have to set aside their manuscript for a while, and I just had this issue with an author who was about to go on maternity leave, and she basically said, so do I talk to you again in a year, or how does this work? And what I suggested was that she sit down and write a punch list of everything that she needed to do once she picked it up again. So that way, when she came off maternity leave, rather than thinking, where do I get started on this? She had written out a list of everything she wanted to fix in each chapter. She wrote down a list of every additional historical fact she needed to verify. So that way, she didn't have to worry about getting reoriented once she began again. She was able just to pick up a checklist and say, here's exactly where I was at. I'm not going to lose anything right now. I'm really sorry. We've hit our time. We have to sign off. Any concluding comments or thoughts?
Thank you all.
Yeah, this was a great turnout. Thank you to everyone who came.
Thank you,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you for the questions.
Yeah, and we're always happy to answer more questions. Like I said, just reach out over social media or email.
Definitely.
And I know that we didn't get to answer all the questions. Feel free to ask me on Twitter. Feel free to shoot any of us an email, and we'd be happy to work through those with you. But thank you for clearing time out of your day to come hear from us. Thank you.